and start the first in a series on configuration management. Rick, if you go ahead.
All right. Thank you, Paul, and thank you for the introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and appreciate the time that you're spending with us this morning to talk about the CMDB. And the CMDB is actually a very passionate subject of mine. I've been doing quite a bit of CMDB work of late, and certainly my history with at least the BMC Atrium CMDB actually started before Atrium was even released. I started with a CMDB project pre-GA, believe it or not. I was working in the Pacific Northwest, and a customer was, a BMC customer was piloting Atrium, and yours truly and a few others were a part of a pre-general availability implementation. So my time with Atrium CMDB does go back a ways. But you know, with that, actually, I was still working on a project, a new project on the CMDB, because why is the CMDB getting attention again? It's been a number of years that CMDB has, you know, the idea and the concept of a configuration management database has been introduced via ITIL v2. It's been revised with ITIL v3, but you know, I am seeing it from my perspective a renewed interest in Atrium or in CMDB in general, but certainly BMC's Atrium product, to try to get more out of the current infrastructure. And we're going to talk about that today, really dialing all the way back to the beginning about why undertake a CMDB project. And you know, CMDB, depending on where you're from, could be a quote-unquote four-letter word, right? So, you know, if you're going to go step back into the CMDB waters, make sure you're having a clear project charter, tantamount for project success, defining the scope, and you know, by the way, there are some new concepts I think that would resonate with those who have undergone a CMDB project or currently working on a CMDB project, supporting a legacy implementation, etc. So I'd like to, you know, have you spend, you know, particular attention on the implementation approach in that architecture section. Because I hope some of the things that we talk about there are new and different to what you're doing today, and that'll set you up, I think, for what potentially is a new phase of your CMDB journey that will be more successful than it is today, and certainly gain more value out of your investment. So we're going to wrap up with just a quick Q&A, and I'll turn it back over to Paul as a wrap up. All right. So with that, let's get going. So a little bit of this is motherhood and apple pie in terms of you know, defining a project charter, but I think it was worth going through a couple of slides on defining the project charter, excuse me, as it pertains to a CMDB initiative. And you know, at the C-level, senior management level, IT strategic initiatives really focus on, from my perspective, in three major areas. You know, they always wanted to create and it's more value IT does to the business. They wanted to be able to respond to the business and provide more agility in a pretty competitive world. Always IT needs to continue to do what they do, or more of what they do, at a lower cost. And this notion of governance and compliance and all of those metrics around quality and availability, improving what we do today, the blocking and tackling of delivering IT services, you know, those are the three major access points from my standpoint. You can group why do an IT project and why do a CMDB project. So with that, you know, these are also general concepts that shouldn't be new to everyone on the phone. You know, providing a solution requires you to spend multiple cycles on multiple areas. You know, if you come from any of the, you know, larger projects, we really talk about people, process, and technology. But I wanted to remind guys that a little bit more into the trenches, that you know, the senior executives talk about people, process, and technology for sure, and those are the cornerstones of a solutions blueprint, if you will. But you know, as the folks that kind of deliver on these solutions, I'd like to introduce three other primary areas for focus, and that's around integrations, data, and metrics. So those 6 categories define what I call the primary blueprint elements to deliver a quality solution. The secondary items on the right around those particular areas really, from my perspective, continue to make or break a project. So you can do all of the primary blocking and tackling, and if you're a program or project manager on the phone and you're listening right now, you can do the blocking and tackling of the primary elements and certainly manage cost and budget of the project. But the softer side, the more subjective elements of a project, around organization, organizational change management, the procedures, the one level down from process. You're going into more of the procedures and how do I, if I'm a user that's being impacted by the project, how do I do my job tomorrow versus what I'm doing today? And to be able to connect those dots, if you will, to the major organization, the users in the organization that will be using the solution. And to do it so that their job is easier and more efficient, and we're providing usable solutions. So that last item, boy, if you're a UI designer, you know Remedy, and you can count the number of mouse clicks. I've been on a number of projects where people start counting mouse clicks. We will not want to add additional mouse clicks to the solution that we deliver. So how do we make sure we don't do that and we make their jobs more efficient? Okay, so those are the major areas, if in summary, the primary and the secondary, the blueprint element. And it's worth a note, so I thought, I'd present that early on into this presentation. So as we get into further, buying into the idea that we should, undertake maybe a new initiative on configuration management, because it has been around for a while. People always start to one degree or another with the definition of what is configuration management. And I pulled these off of different websites. I think it was Wiki around ITIL. You start with a definition of what is the purpose of configuration management. So this is a little bit of a textbook example, and I brought this up on purpose of a textbook example. If you read and provide this information to senior management, they're going to go, great. Okay, so what does it really mean to me? What does it really mean to the organization? If you're implementing configuration management that is a repository that acts as a data warehouse, great. Those are non-fighting words. They sound good, but what does it mean, right? As you move on to more of the process, and a little bit notion of a service asset, people are going to go, what is a service asset? Don't get caught up in the ITIL terminology, because, from my perspective, I've found that's a little bit of a non-starter for the non-techie management type person. What you really want to do is start into the why. Driving the business value from a project like CMDB, where we are intent to lower the maintenance cost, or improve service levels and uptime, or improve the data quality for better trending analysis, or decreasing the compliance with risks associated with our SOX applications. Those are very clearly stated goals of a project. And those, regardless of what you saw on the prior slide, you're going to have to connect the dots to management to be able to fund your project or fund a new phase of your initiative to be able to deliver on increased value brought to you by ICMS initiative. So forget that prior slide, focus on this, establish a clear why. And what I'd like to do is also insert one of the avoid pitfalls slide. There are about 5 pitfalls that I've included in this deck about what to avoid as you undertake this. So clearly you want to establish the why and you want to stay focused, but also make sure that you maintain that focus all the way through the scope and the content of your project. And I'll talk about what content is, but it is around the data. Data is a huge challenge under any CMDB, CMS initiative. So how do you stay focused and to fine-tune the content of your CMDB instead of just blasting in a bunch of data into the CMS? Because we know more is not always better. In fact, less is more in many projects for around CMDB. So this is kind of that initial tops-down view of establishing a clear why. As you move on, we're going to talk about scope in a second. So I believe that now's a little bit of a time to establish a break, any Q&A. We'd like to make it very interactive this session. So if there are any chat items, Paul, before moving to the scope section, let's talk about chart and what you've heard so far. So any questions?
Thanks, Rick. I just posted up, and we haven't had any questions to this point so far.
All right, very good. So let's move on to the scope. So a couple elements that I'd like to talk about to you all around the scope. So a recent project that I've been working on, when people look at CMDB and they take an ITIL-oriented view of a CMDB project, invariably they look at the major processes around configuration management. And those major processes, as you can see here, are planning, identification, control, monitoring, verification, and you may be able to add audit as part of that as a separate line item. But as a process-oriented CMDB project, config project, invariably we start talking about, controlling the CI, because that's what ITIL v2 said we had to do. We have to control our CIs better. So you go through this definition of what is a CI, define a CI for our organization, and then define the processes and the tools that will help us identify those CIs. And people think automatically discovery, or controlling CIs, and people think automatically about change, or monitoring CIs, people think about incident, maybe event monitoring, etc. So, but they take on, these type of projects take on a very process-oriented view of managing the CIs as part of the CMS config process. So I'm here to say that's only part of the scope that you need to consider. So what you see here are what I call consumer processes, consumer areas that surround the CMDB, that surround and interlock in the processes that support the CMDB, and those are highlighted in the smaller circles. So if you do spend your time in defining scope, it should not, I repeat that, it should not be completely around managing the CMDB, managing the information in the CMDB. The more important, quite frankly, more important area of why a CMDB project is around those consumer processes. So this is kind of motherhood and apple pie for many of you, but I do want to iterate that, if you take on an ITIL process view of a configuration management project, certainly we need the processes as you saw on the prior slide. But I would argue that, taking a look at incident management, change management, problem management, and then adopting those processes or maturing those processes and those tools to better use information that is maintained in the CMDB is a better avenue for success. So you will find, and I have always found, that there's going to be a lot of push and pull between the CMDB and the processes and discovering data, et cetera, and populating it. But and oftentimes where we find that CMDB projects are challenging is we spend too much time on the config process side and not enough time on the circles that surround the CMDB. You should invert that. So if you find yourself in a project talking about identifying, and you count the number of hours or the percentage of time you're spent about identifying or controlling the CI itself, and not about those processes and how they're going to use your data in your CMDB, you need to invert that conversation. You should really be talking about the incident process. You should really be talking about how to diagnose or how to better triage an incident. You should really be talking about how can we more quickly identify the impacted services based on this incident. Those are the things ultimately should drive the conversation to, okay, then how can the CMDB, how can the information in the CMDB, how can the relationships in the CMDB support a better and improved, a more productive incident process. And those in turn, as part of the project scope, if you focus on improving incident management, you focus on improving change management, you have to then pick and choose what areas, consumer processes that you want to focus on as your project charter. You would invariably have multiple push and all the items on the circle, these are certainly not every item around CMDB can benefit from a CMDB project. Your job as a project manager, as a program manager, as a lead, etc., is to choose and to choose carefully. And if you find out that your conversations are in more than 3 of these circles at a time, that should be a yellow flag for you. Because if it is more than 3, you're in danger of scope creep. You're certainly in danger of just going very wide and not providing that level of efficiency that you're looking at for one particular area, and you're spreading your project, your resources, your time a little bit too thin across too many different processes. So that is a very clear indicator. If you're doing anything more than 3 at a given time, you're probably spending too much time. If you're talking about asset management and incident management and capacity and availability, you have to, in my opinion, drop one of them. If you drop one of them, put more wood behind those arrows, the fewer errors, and then spend that time on those particular processes. Because you will find, by the way, that in some cases, and a lot of cases, the vendors do not provide you clear enough integration to these consumer processes. They provide very lightweight integration. And you are going to try to drive efficiency gains and improvements. And you're going to find potentially you need to tweak the out of the box. You need to add more hooks. You need to add more automated or steps as part of how to triage an incident through and use CMS more efficiently. Those are the things that if you truly dive a little bit deeper and address some of those secondary elements that we talked about, will have you kind of spend more time in that area and really get into that, how is my job going to change tomorrow than what I do today? And if you find yourself saying, well, you're just going to start relating a CI to an incident record, that may or may not be providing a lot of value. And most likely it's providing another step in a very busy person's day. And if you're on the service desk working at, tickets 8 hours a day, that's going to provide a lot of additional mouse clicks. So they may not provide any benefit. So if you find yourself doing that, we're not going deep enough, or you're targeting the wrong user in the wrong role in the IT organization. So all those things, by the way, really help define and refine your scope. So ultimately, what I'd like to do is present to you this high-level concept of a scope matrix. So what you see here is on the blueprint solutions, those are the major items on the right, or sorry, on the left. If we choose as part of the project charter, this is kind of the focus that we're going to have for the CMDB initiative. Again, I just chose one of the more obvious ones. Your goal as, refining the scope of the CMS project, the CMDB project, is to fill out this matrix in enough detail to provide you clear timelines, tasks, objectives, schedule, etc., in addressing each of these items. So you see here there's people elements, there's process elements, there's technology integration data and metric elements, and certainly this is just an example for you all. But you can kind of get a sense as to this phase of your CMDB project. You're going to be touching the two major support areas. You can be touching two major process areas. From a technology integration standpoint, you're going to be integrating 4 different tools and do 2 major integrations to your application performance management tools and your enterprise system management tools. You're going to be dealing with this amount of data, these major categories of data, and driving and influencing some of these key metrics, including mean time to respond and mean time to repair. Those are the things you can see, and they are aligned along the bottom to those major consumer processes around the CMDB. So, have incident, change, problem, etc. This is kind of giving you that higher level matrix that will define your roadmap or the major activities for your release 1 or your phase 1. Okay, so I encourage you to kind of take a look at that, take a snapshot, and see if you can build out this high level scope matrix for your given project or your new initiative, and make sure that as a pitfall number 2, make sure those secondary blueprint elements, i.e. organization, procedures, efficiency gains, all those things you can point to that we are making IT better with this CMDB project. Okay, so this was something that I found a visual that I found hopefully very useful to you all, and you can leverage that. I'd be very happy to hear how this worked out for you in any type of future discussion. Okay, so with that, we're going to take another quick Q&A break, and so Paul, I'll take a stop at this point and ask if there are any open questions.
Yeah, we have a question from Tim, and just wanted to know how important is a services approach in the strategy of narrowing the scope, and is it an absolute must?
Not necessarily, and Tim is going to be talking. That's our next. We talk about the approach of implementation services and option, and he's actually ahead of us in the agenda. So we'll be touching on what he's asking in the next section.
Okay, thanks, Rick. That's the only question I have at this point.
All right, very good. So let's go ahead and move on. So selecting the right implementation approach. So Tim, hopefully this makes sense for you, what you're about to see, and it will directly address the question you have about starting with a service approach. So in my dealings with various CMDB projects over the last 3 to 4 years, I pretty much synthesized there are roughly 3 different approaches you can take about implementing your CMDB project. So this is getting further past the charter, further past the scope. We have a clear scope, we know what areas, those blueprint elements, we know what we're going to be focused on. Stay focused, please. But now we're about the implementation and what I call a bottoms-up traditional approach. So you can see in this graphic is it's somewhat of a high-level graphic, but this is what I call the bottoms-up or traditional approach, where it is primarily asset or discovery-based. So, everybody knows they don't want to maintain the data. You're going to have millions of CIs in your CMDB in a very mature state. And in a very mature state, you're going to have a lot of CIs. So I have found that people want to fast track that. And they want to fast track that, and very early on in ITIL v2 type implementations, people just pointed a discovery tool at their CMDB and turned on the faucet, right? So people know nobody's going to maintain this data manually, so heck, that's a major showstopper if we have to maintain this data manually. So we find out all the automated ways, the vendor tools to help us do that. So that's definitely one of the pros. It's more automated, it's more straightforward, it's talking about data pipes, reconciliation rules, etc. I get to provide you with as much discovered data as I reasonably can as I deploy discovery tools out there in the infrastructure in the various data centers. I can do basic scans, deeper level 3 scans, and all those things kind of are very tool-centric. So it typically tends to be a little bit more infrastructure-oriented because I'm really pretty much discovering opening port information, port communication. I'm doing, again, credential-based scanning. So I get as much detail about the CIs that are within a given subnet as you would ever care to know, right? And that has a purpose, by the way, because once you do that, it's certainly very automated. It helps me do a lot of audit checks, which servers are out of compliance with a given service pack and security release or a service pack release. All those things are some of the goodness that comes out of this type of approach. This type of approach, if you go back to the charter and you go back to the scope, it makes sense based on those two factors. It may or may not make sense based on other factors. So is your number one goal or project charter why you're doing this next version of your CMDB is around security and compliance? Option one makes a lot of sense, especially if I want to do it around Windows and Linux servers or my web servers, etc. This makes a lot of sense to take that approach if that is your goal and that's your charter. But also realize that this approach does have some disadvantages. So you may or may not have the wherewithal to, Tim and team, link all that CI data to the right applications and to the IT services that they represent. And then based on the discovery tool and what's out there, we know how difficult it is to discover custom applications, etc. So, how do you link all that infrastructure to the application? And I tell you, that I've seen so many different ways, to solve this problem. I know the tools partially solve this problem, but to solve this problem about linking all this infrastructure to IT service and apps, it's a very challenging set of activities. And I've seen all different types of ways how people do that, all different types of ways. So, and there's issues with all of them. And the second con is, well, you know what? It may provide a lot of detail. In fact, too much detail or too much noise. So you have to be careful of that. And then so realizing those cons, people start saying, well, Rick, why don't we discover based on X? Or why don't we filter out the discovery based on Y? Based on service or based on some other construct that is hard for these discovery tools to implement. But, there are definitely things that we can do there, as you know. But there are definitely some good and some cons, if you will, about this approach. It's going to be a bottoms-up approach. So if you kind of understand that, I'll reiterate one more time. To leverage this option again based on your project charter, based on the scope and the problems you're trying to solve with your CMDB, this may make sense. Option two is the inverse of option one, and I call this the tops-down approach. So this takes, the definition, we want to make sure that the business understands what we're doing. So we want to go out there and do it by this service-oriented model, right? And of those of you who kind of have done this before, one of the biggest challenges that I've had, since, well, I can't remember how, 8+ years ago, and even proceeding to today, is what services does IT provide? And I've seen in a couple of questionnaires or answers to you all attending this this presentation, this webinar, there's a strong service catalog influence to your CMDB projects, and this is why. IT in the business, they want to be more synergistic. They want to be able, IT wants to provide and define the services that IT delivers. That in of itself is certainly a challenge, but if you can get through and define those services, then you can kind of iterate and do that tops-down approach of defining your services, the applications, the components, and the infrastructure that support those services. So it is very tops-down. It does, establish these important non-discoverable CIs out of the gate. I'm sure those of you who've taken this approach, it's a bit of a challenge to maintain these non-discoverable relationships potentially. So, if you can do that, there are definitely some benefits. And one of the first obvious benefits is that this aligns your CMS to your business in a more clear, more straightforward way that senior leadership can understand. So if it does that, you get more support, people go, great. And it also supports, by the way, what I consider a very important area is it supports the change use cases more seamlessly. And why do I say that? If you take the BMC model where you open up a change request, you want to say this change affects this service, right? That first initial service CI, right? And the definition of service versus application a little bit blurry. But in any event, it does support that change, and then the underlying component that you're going to modify by that change request, it's a clearer, more straightforward implementation of a CMS that supports the change process. So those are all good things. The downside of this approach, if you've done this, and I would be looking to hear if this is true or not, is that you will find that many of these CIs will be not discoverable, or they'll be certainly hard to discover. When you get to that second layer down from the service into this applications, how do you automatically identify those applications running in your infrastructure? Those custom apps, certainly the third-party apps are a little more straightforward, but a lot of custom applications a little harder. How can you define them so that when discovery kind of bottoms up, fills in the detail, the two pieces kind of come together? It's kind of like the Continental Railroad. I'm starting, top down, you're starting bottoms up. We need to meet in the middle. So having to do that and making sure those two align is a little bit of a challenge. And certainly if you are getting thrown some curveballs along the way and you get thrown a very detailed configuration use case and you're starting with this tops-down approach, you may have to say, I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to deliver that until phase 2 or phase 3. But this, does take on the service catalog, service-based view. It's more logical, it's less discoverable, but certainly it does align more clearly to the business and the services that IT provides. Okay, so that's option 2. And I mentioned there's a third option, and in fact, the third option is where I kind of fall into is my preferred option, right? Is what I consider this continuous process or use case-based approach. So, again, going back to the charter and the scope of your CMDB project, if you're clearly going to improve the availability of your service and increase availability, increase the quality and uptime, if that's your charter, right, you're going to attack that particular area hands down. You're going to focus on that. And you're going to build out the relevant CIs that support that use case, right? So what that means is I am only populating CIs that are based on the use case, and I'm leaving everything else for later. And what that happens allows you to do, by the way, if you take this approach, you're going to combine elements of option 1 and option 2. Yes, you're going to define the service, maybe define the application, and you may or may not discover the details around those servers, etc. But you're going to just build out that slice of the organization to support and the CI and the CI types of that service that support the use case. So if you're finding out you're having a lot of database issues around some critical applications, or you're having storage issues around some critical applications, or you're having network type issues, affecting a data center, you take those specific use cases and only populate the CMDB with those relevant CIs. So if in case you're having storage issues, right, you're drawing a very clear, you're defining out all the storage CIs, you're drawing a very quick and dirty storage CI to application or storage CI to service. You're forgetting everything else in between. You're leaving that for later. And you're drawing out those very quick and dirty use case-based CIs and those use case-based service models that attack that problem. So it's a little bit of a hybrid approach. It leaves you to fill in the detail later as your CMDB matures, but what are the advantages of this type of approach? So management should realize more quickly the value of the CMS. In my last customer project, I was in a meeting with a senior manager, a high-level senior leader within the IT organization, my customer, and he was new to the organization. We've been starting this project for 4 months. We're 4 months into the project. He comes in as a new senior director, and he goes, "Why are we doing CMDB? I've done this 2 other times in 2 other places, and both times have failed." So, those were his, in this case, his experience with CMDB projects. He was not an advocate, and he asked those tough questions, why are we doing this for a 3rd time? If that's kind of what you have experienced, taking this approach will show benefits more quickly. Because again, if you're spending a lot of your time doing discovery and dealing with security issues and network and scanning issues, you're going to spend a lot of time, wrestling that monster before you see, just to populate the CMDB and then attack the use cases that are problematic in the organization. So this circumvents all that. The second pro in my mind of this option is it's for those who like this notion of continuous process improvement, which I'm a big advocate of, right? The iterative, agile, consumer, iterative, continuous process improvement approach. This does that. This allows you, use case by use case, take low-hanging fruit, the big items, etc. Do that and iterate on that and keep on iterating on that. So, if you can establish a baseline project to do this continuous process improvement work, over time your CMDB project will grow. The CIs in your CMDB will grow and it will mature. And over time, you are 3 or 4 major use cases. If you tackle those, you will see major value and improvement that the CMDB provides your organization. So those, again, the pro. There's less danger. Again, if you go with option 1 versus option 3, you find that potentially, again, you're going to be slamming a lot of data into your CMDB. This option 3 avoids that. Some disadvantages of this option. The notion of what I call a patchwork. The CMDB will evolve as a patchwork quilt. So those who do quilting or understand that these little squares that you kind of put into your quilt, into your patch or work frame, that your CMDB will evolve in a patchwork-like way, which is okay, but it's new and different way of building out your CMDB that management typically doesn't understand. So you're going to have to educate them in this use case-based model. It will likely require higher levels of maintenance because you're filling in these major quadrants of CMDB data, and you're going to fill in the details later. Doing that most likely have you defining non-discoverable CIs more in the beginning than at the end. So you're going to find that you're going to have a higher level of maintenance. You're going to have to realize how you're going to maintain that. You're going to have to come up with ways or establish roles in your organization to maintain this. But, theoretically, if you do this with enough wherewithal, that higher level of maintenance will more than pay for itself because of the improved efficiencies, improved uptime, shorter, MTTR, all those things. Management will gladly pay for a higher level of maintenance on your CMDB to continue on your path for continuous process improvement. And the last con is certainly that if you again have you throw in some requirements that are very detailed config oriented, like the classic one is, Rick, tell me which Windows servers have this level of Windows patch on it. Well, guess what? If you take this approach, you will not be able to run that report out of your CMDB. And I say that's okay because you're going to run that report out of your discovery tool. You don't have to run it out of your CMDB. But just keep in mind or be aware that there are some very detailed, specific config use cases that you will not be able to address with option 3. Okay? So option 3, first option again in summary, that discovery, bottoms-up approach. Second option was that tops-down, very service or model approach. And this option 3, this use case or this patchwork continuous process improvement approach. Those are the 3 methods that I would, espouse you to kind of really think about and map which option best supports your charter and your scope. Okay? So anyway, I think we're at the end of this section. One more, and then I'll answer the question I think that coming from Bobby. So finally, this concept of eating the elephant. And if you're a part of a large organization, a large IT organization that have hundreds of thousands of CIs, logical, physical, and relationship CIs, you have 5,000 plus servers, etc., you need to eat that elephant. And again, as you establish not only the initial scope based on your charter for your CMS project, you have to kind of phase that out over time. And this is a very, very quick and dirty, high-level idea about how I would phase a project that eats the elephant. And you can talk about it's not only process-oriented, and this is very process-oriented for the consumer processes, right? And interspersed with the consumer view of the world, it intersperses what CIs that I'm going to care about, and theoretically what config process improvement items, the core config, how I'm going to maintain this data, will be interwoven into this phased approach. It's not a waterfall approach. This is very iterative in nature. It's very agile in nature. Excuse me. And ultimately, from my perspective, this is the best way to show maximum benefit at the earliest possible time versus getting caught up in the minutia details of CI reconciliation issues that I've been a part of. Believe me, I've been a part of those type of projects, and we are challenged to show the value, right, of that really the CMS can provide. So I encourage you to eat that elephant, define the phases, make sure you take a look at the features and the deliverables you're going to do to improve those consumer processes, and do that in such a way that each phase can be delivered in 6 to 9 months or sooner, right? So if you find yourself, as you kind of work through your detailed WBS schedule, that all the tasks add up to more than 6+ months, you need to scope that back even further. And I want you all to, once you do that exercise, pay particular attention to two very important areas on that blueprint element slide. Pay particular attention to the integrations and the number of them, and the type of CI data. So again, if you're doing it use case based, it's going to drive the type of CI data that you're going to care about in phase 1. And if you find that you have to, if you do your CMDB modeling, and that's actually part 2 of our roadmap series, our webinar series, if you find you have to populate too many different types of CI classes, that should be a yellow flag for you all. All right, and you want to keep the number of CI types to a minimum per phase. So with that, Paul, I will open up to another round of Q&As. Hopefully that wasn't too fast for everyone, but I do see Stacy did ask a question from Bobby. So Paul, is that the first question, or is that?
Yeah, it is. Go ahead if you got the question there.
So Bobby's asking, why can't you do option 1 and 2 meet in the middle? You can. That is absolutely possible. But I found that, Bobby, that depending on where you are in your discovery, that in and of itself, if you're rolling out a discovery tool and a dependency mapping, a TADM type or ADDM type discovery tool, I found that it's really challenging to do both well. But if you are finding that you've already deployed your discovery solutions, 1 or more of them, then you could potentially do those, have that framework in place, tweak it a little bit, and start with your service modeling, and hopefully they meet in the middle, okay, with the right architecture. So we're going to talk about the architecture in a second. So you can do it. You better have a jump start from my perspective on the pure discovery stuff, because that could be a challenge in and of itself.
We have another question from Bobby. He's asking what types, I'm sorry, it was actually this from Mike, and then another question for Bobby. There's 2 more coming in. So far, this is only a number of CIs that we're focused on in our models. What about data flow connections and server-to-server data transactions?
So when we say data connections, are we talking about transaction-oriented data connections, or are we talking about the discovery data connections? So I have a question on that. But if you're looking at the discovery data connections, right, that certainly is what I call the foundational plumbing, right? To identify what are your sources of data, your discovery source of data or systems of data, and do that what I call foundational work. That has to be into every given project. New integration points that I lump in under integrations, actually, as part of that blueprint element, make sure you list those out. Discovery tools come out of the woodwork, spreadsheets and other systems of record come out of the woodwork as you get into the project, so you have to be very careful about that. But if you worry about the data connections, Paul, that should be included in the number of integrations you're going to have to do. So the second part of your question was?
Yeah, Rick, and I think Mike, I'm going to open up. Mike, your microphone is open unless I saw your hand raised there, so I think you wanted to add a follow-up on that question. Go ahead.
I guess you're talking about me. It's Mike, Mike Ilmer. One of the requirements what I have is that we have quite complex infrastructure with number of redundancy, and management wants to know and see those connections. We discover them. We found about 35,000 interconnections between different servers. We put them to CMDB. But if you open Adrium Explorer, it looks ugly. You cannot actually trace for a complex system what's going on where. But management wants to know that from this computer somewhere, how it goes through the what data flow goes from one place to another.
Right.
Yeah, and if you have few applications that talking to each other, and they can talk to each other through the TCP, through some other channels, even file system. They want to know that, yes, in fact, this application talking to another one through set of computers and set of transactions, including ports. And again, we able to discover ports, and we know that this Java process talking to the web services over there.
Yeah, so you probably use a discovery tool to get that information, right? And you're probably realizing how these discovery tools are very noisy. And when you pull those discovery tools and the data, the relationship into CMDB, and then view it in Atrium console, you're saying, Mike, there's too much data, too much noise. I can't make heads or tails out of the diagram I'm seeing, right? That's one of the absolute downsides of you doing that bottoms-up implementation, is the noise that you expose into the viewer. So what I would suggest, is make sure that really the use case you're trying to solve requires that much data. And what I would also do, unfortunately, is look at what type of custom reporting could I do out of the CMDB to, filter out the noise that the UI, the Atrium viewer, cannot easily filter out. I mean, I consider that a little bit of a limitation in the BMC tool if you are using BMC, to be able to surface the right relationships, the right, it's a little bit combination of the viewer and the views that you can create, but also all the relationship data that isn't intelligent enough. You would almost have to, create a custom report to kind of, filter out some of the classes or filter out some of the detail of your viewer that is not available in the viewer itself. So I don't know if that's helpful or not. There is kind of in my part 2 of the webinar, I talk about some other logical relationships that kind of ride above the detailed discovered relationship that you're finding is too noisy, to help with that. So that's a concept that I'm going to talk about in the next webinar presentation to address exactly what you're suggesting. Okay, I know it's not a good answer, but that's one of the absolute challenges of doing a bottoms-up discovery-oriented implementation, is all that data, and hard to view it. So, okay, so designing a flexible, extensible architecture. This is something that also I find, hopefully will be new and different to you all, and gives you stop and think about what have we done, what could we do differently or better to improve on our implementation if you have a CMDB, or if you're new to this and looking to kind of re-engineer it. I'd like you to spend a little bit of particular attention to this section of the presentation. So with that, let's get into it. I took a screenshot off of one of the various websites. This was ZDNet actually, but I wanted to first give you guys a cloud primer. if cloud is new to you, there are multiple different ways of delivering an application in the cloud. So on the far left, you see that's kind of the traditional model. I am homegrown, I'm custom, I built a package solution and I'm deploying it within my data center. And these, from a cloud model, right? If you go to any website, Google this, you will find that these are the layers that these typical IT software cloud providers look at when they're running a service or an application. Starting with networking at the bottom, you can see you can move up the stack, if you will, the compute stack, through the server virtualization layer, OS layer, middleware layer, and it moves into kind of the runtime and data information layer in the application itself. So that's all colored orange. It means that you as a IT staff person within your organization, you've built all of these layers of the stack. As you move to the right, these are these different services that cloud providers provide you that you can purchase from them. There's something called infrastructure as a service, and the 4 bottom layers are provided by those service providers. If they do platform as a service, you can see they move up the stack and run almost everything except for your data and your application. And your far right, software as a service, the service now is Remedy Force, Remedy on Demand, Salesforce.com. Software as a service provides you the entire stack. But so you can see those different elements of those different variations of a software as a service, a platform as a service, etc. But more importantly, what I want you to see is the different traditional layers in the stack. And again, networking, storage, virtualization, OS. So that is somewhat simplistically, but somewhat not simplistically, is how people, organizations, IT vendors, etc., model out the infrastructure. So the first key concept that I want you to kind of put in the back of your head is, as you build out the CMDB, and that cloud, whether you're doing private cloud or public cloud or software as a service or what have you, and you have to make a decision around your CMDB implementation, is can my CMDB project, can it scale to not only host and model out the traditional software solutions, my in-house homegrown or traditionally vendor-provided solutions, and can it scale to these other alternate software platform as a service models? And do I even have to model it at all if I'm a software as a service? You have to make sure that your CMDB can support each of these major compute models. That's kind of major takeaway point number 1. Does it support it? And major takeaway point number 2 is looking at the different layers in this model, application on down to networking. How do I model it in Atrium, if Atrium is your CMDB? So we'll get into the details of this modeling exercise later. But what I want to do is kind of still at the conceptual level talk to you how some key concepts and how I would love if you would grow and mature your CMDB along what I consider this logical data architecture. So it's a high-level conceptual / logical model of your infrastructure. And it starts with services. Notice, by the way, this back cloud services model, nothing talks about services. Services right on top of your applications. So that's kind of difference number 1 between these cloud models and what we as IT do and soon to be care about, is you try to model your business services and your IT services first, right, as a conceptual holder of within your architecture. And then you model, let's look at the big chunks of information here. Then from your IT services, your business services down, the next layer of your modeling, your data architecture, really talks about 2 major classifications of information. It's your applications and your application systems. And those are, if you kind of model that or map that to the prior slide, hopefully you can kind of see how those different layers fit within these logical architecture layers. And then server, storage, network, data center, facilities, down to that if you care about that, if those are important use cases, important business drivers for your CMDB implementation, you model it down to the data center facility layer. So these, starting with IT services, applications, application systems, server, storage, network, data center, those 7 major classifications of information make up your logical data architecture of your CMS. That's where you have to hang your hat on. And if you hang your hat on these 1, 2, 3, 4, 7 layers, then you have a question to ask. How much detail do I fill in with each of these major layers, right? Do I fill in the details in my application, layer? Do I fill in the details around my application systems, around components and functions? Do I fill in the details of servers, i.e. what software is running on it, or what servers are communicating to other servers? That relationship information that Mike just asked. Do I need to populate the CMDB with that information? Same with storage, network, and data centers. So here is the architecture, the logical architecture that sets the foundation, the underpinnings of whatever you do to populate the CMDB with the necessary information. If you are very new, or if your CMDB is a mess, it's very flat, you just have a bunch of computer systems in your CMDB, or 80–90% of it, plus some relationship of server to server, and it's a very flat model, it doesn't have any structure on top of that, then potentially you need to introduce that structure on that data. And if you introduce that structure on that data, it gets into these concepts of logical or semi-discoverable CIs, those type of things. We covered that in option 2. But make sure, whatever you do, bottoms up or tops down, you start with these basics. And then I would again encourage you, start with the basics and then fill in the details behind the basics. So start with your server inventory and then slowly open up what software that I care about that sit on those servers. Don't just blow through a level 3 scan and populate all this data, CPU, memory, number of cores, all that stuff into the CMDB, because that may or may not be necessary. You may just care about, believe it or not, the name of the server, right? And the type of the server, whether it's Windows or Linux or Unix or what have you. That may be the only elements of data that you care about that make up your server logical data architecture. And that's okay. You don't have to go further. And it make it use case driven to get more detail as the use cases derived needed to be supported, etc. So those are the things that I'd like you to kind of take a step back and think about. Is if you understand the compute models on the prior slide, you understand the basic organization of the CMDB and these notions of classes, and you understand these kind of major definition areas, start to make sure that you have these pretty well defined. You know what's going to fit here, etc. And then start a little bit more carefully before you fill in the details around these components, functions, software, products, you name it, before you go nuts in populating the CMDB. That's kind of the the major takeaway on this section is this data architecture. The second major element of this data architecture is the actual elements itself. So when you're looking at your model and the data, the details of the data that you care about, I found this slide on the web and I thought it was really applicable for this discussion today. Is when you look at your CIs, you really are looking about the data that make up the CIs. And notice how much data, the classification of data, or these data elements that I may or may not care about given in the particular phase. So make sure you have a good handle on what class of or element of data for a CI that I want to maintain or keep in the CMDB. It may have everything to do around, people tend to focus on the discoverable attributes of that configuration item. But notice on this circle, that's only one of many pieces of information that I may or may not care about that CI itself. So make sure you understand clearly, based again on scope, chart, or use cases, etc., what elements I care about. And much like I said in the past, this is iterative, this is agile, focus on 2 or 3 areas, and you find you have to hit 8 of these different things around the axis or around the wheel, then that's another yellow flag for you. I'm doing too much too soon. My use cases are too scattered. We have to care about org data, location data, status data, event data, supplier data, SLA data, all this data, and I have no idea how I'm going to maintain it once I even try to populate it. So that's definitely a yellow flag. So again, starting, in that model, again, choosing the different options, but storing the CI information, storing a lot of it, doesn't make it better. I think we all know that. BMC talks about federation. That's certainly not a panacea in my mind, but making sure that you store the necessary information to support these different data elements. And believe it or not, I've started with CMDB projects that only have 4 or 5 attributes in the CI. That's it. And you're going, Rick, that's crazy. Well, I would argue that if those 4 or 5 attributes hit the top 3 use cases, and we're use case driven, that's all you need. And you don't need tons of other data like IP address, host name, fully qualified, patch level. Why do I need that if my use case says I don't need it? Okay. So I know I'm running out of time. Very quickly, I'm going to blow through the rest of these slides. Mapping the service model to the CI data. This is kind of the next concept once you have to know which data elements you want. And finally, this is kind of where I wanted you all to end up, is if I go through each of the layers in the service model, I started off with business applications, moving on down to data centers. Make sure you have an idea of what elements are required for each of the major classes of information in my service model. Notice that they're not all the same. If I get down to the server level, I may care about event and status and maintenance information. And I may not care about it in the higher levels in the model, right? Higher level, applications or certainly business services or IT services, we may or may not care about that. So notice also some challenges around SLAs and the roll-up issues around SLAs. If I care about SLAs throughout the stack, that's a challenge in of itself because there's a natural roll-up progression of SLAs and availability. So that's a little bit of an area that I'd love to know if you guys or anybody is attacking the SLA issue, because I found that particularly challenging. But finally, pitfall number 5, focus on the elements that address the scope and use cases versus what's provided by your discovery tools. And then finally, make sure that based on the service model, that logical architecture we talked about, you have a clear understanding of what data is required to support that different class in that model. Okay? So in summary, why CMDB? We talked about 4 major items. We talked about the project charter, defining why and staying focused on the project charter, defining the scope and defining what and staying focused there. We talked about 3 different implementation approaches: the discovery, bottoms up, service-based, tops down, and this use case is patchwork-based, use case-driven implementation approach. Make sure you justify which approach I'm going to take. And finally, that extensible and flexible architecture. Understand what the cloud computing model looks like, the different layers in the stack, mapping it to your logical architecture, and making sure you understand the data elements that support each layer in the logical architecture. That's setting your foundation, in my mind, for the detailed implementation of your project. All right. So with that, how can EffectTap help? We just launched a little bit of a new service offering where we call the CMDB Health Check. It's something that you can sign up through Paul and on our website. If you want to discuss more of what you've heard today, we would be glad to assist you. It's a short conference call, a 1 to 2 hour conference call where you can talk about it, what your challenge is, and potentially how we can help. Certainly, we hope that's a free service that we provide to you, and certainly that will hopefully lead that to a lasting partnership with your organization. And finally, what's coming in part 2. This is probably a 3 or 4 part presentation series, and in part 2, these are the things I'm going to be talking about. I'll let you look at it in a second. Classes, views, relationships, advanced topics, and implementation best practices. And finally, I'm going to turn it back to Paul. So I'm right at the top of the hour.
Thank you, Rick, and thank you everyone for joining today. I know we're top of the hour, so if those have to drop, if you would just take time to fill out the survey as we look towards the next webinar in the series, we'd love to get your feedback. And for those who can stay around for just another few minutes here, I'll be glad to open up the session for more Q&A options. We have one other question around just for upcoming webinars, and there's interest around will EffectTap be sharing our strategy for slicing up complex services. So that was one of the questions.
The answer is yes on that. Absolutely.
Okay.
We'll get into that into part 2.
Okay. And then there was one other question. I believe it was from Bobby. It was his first question I get a chance to ask. What types of edits do you foresee after a change is completed if option 1 is used?
Edits, that's a good question. In fact, in a bottoms-up discovery-oriented approach, I almost consider the CMDB a read-only database. If we didn't have a lot of service application defined, it's all about discovered data, maybe server products, software, all that stuff, relationships. All that to me is read-only data. So maybe some of the things that are editable are the app and the service, if you get up that high, and connecting apps to apps. I find probably editable data that your IT processes or governance around the CMDB should support. So
thank you.
Hopefully that made sense, what I just said.
If there's any other questions you'd like to ask, just if you raise your hand through the GoToWebinar interface here, I can go ahead and open up your line and you can ask the question directly. It looks like Melanie has a question, so let me open up your mic. There we go. So Melanie, your microphone's open.
Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
So if you're saying, and if you're doing the bottom up approach, and you're saying that it would be a read-only CMDB in a case such as that, if a change request were being done to replace a particular CI, you still wouldn't go and update your CMDB, would you?
Well, theoretically, if discovery is truly, in the bottoms-up model, Melanie, you're going to specify, the host name. Maybe I'm replacing host A with host B in your use case, right?
Yeah.
Usually, well, in my mind, that both hosts are sitting in the environment, right? They've been discovered at some point already. You just haven't turned on host B. It's sitting out there in the network. So again, the fact that you lit up host B as part of your formal change process, theoretically, your discovery tool will pick it up or should have picked it up right away, right? Already. And that CI should be in your CMDB if you're doing a continuous discovery, scanning of your environment. That should be there already in a perfect world.
Then in what way would you actually pick up how many CIs were replaced at a particular site over the last month, let's say?
Yeah, your change report should pick that up, right? So you should still relate those CIs, right, to your change request, right?
Yeah.
So as you go back, and hopefully there's location information as part of the change request as well. But if you're doing based on the opcat and the prodcat of the change, I'm doing a server replacement or upgrade is your op and prodcat values. It also has location, data center location. The detailed change report of the relationship information on your Remedy Relationships tab should be able to tell me what are the new servers I'm deploying and what I'm retiring, theoretically, right? And again, when I see read-only, discovery tools are scanning all your subnets in that data center and picking up those hosts and putting it into the CMDB, right?
Yeah, so then you wouldn't necessarily purge your data that you get rid of out of the CMDB. Once you're replacing something and you're getting rid of it, you still want to keep record of the fact that you've actually replaced that. So the CI shouldn't be deleted per se.
No, you shouldn't be deleted, but that's probably maybe one, going back to the prior, I think it was Bobby's question, what's editable is, I said the higher levels of the, that model, but also the non-discoverable attributes of that CI is probably editable as well. And I've had multiple customers, take the AST forms and make them read-only, all the fields except for a couple, like status, right? So everything about that is read-only, it's discoverable, and maybe status is set to retire through the change record, right? That's probably the only extra piece of data I would consider editable in the use case you're talking about.
Yes. That basically is the only field that's available to be updated manually.
Right. That's right.
All right. Thank you, Melanie.
Okay. Thank you for that.
You're welcome. Thanks for asking the question. Are there any other questions as we wrap up here? Let's take one last poll. Looks like we are complete. So thank you again for attending. Look for an update of the presentation being available on EffectTech later today, as well as a copy of this slide deck will be there if you want to download it as a reference. And then an invite for our next webinar will be about 2 to 3 weeks out. If you're going to be at BMC Engage, please stop by the EffectTech booth. We'd love to meet with you and get a chance to visit. Thanks again, and have a good day.
Thanks, everyone.